And it's actually quite interesting how much demographics constrain what the future will be like. You know, you can't just suddenly change things demographically and have a totally different society. But you should be aware how things can vary and how they potentially could impact future investment opportunities. The obvious sort of examples are, how will birth rates affect China? Or what else will affect China in the future? Should you be investing there or starting to pull back? India, is it going to be the next China? What has to happen demographically for that to happen? Can that happen? So I'm going to raise a whole series of issues as I go through this presentation, and they should leave you probably with more questions than answers.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Brandon Sedloff, Global Head of Business Development and Chief Real Estate Officer at Juniper Square, and I'll be your host. As background, Juniper Square is the leader in technology and fund administration solutions for private markets GPs and is trusted by more than 2,100 GPs to manage over 1 million active investment positions across 38,000 funds and over $1 trillion of investor capital. Over the last few years, our fund administration business has scaled to over 150 billion of assets under administration. There are a few topics that cut across private markets, but demographics is one such topic. Demographics changes impact our world, the way we invest, the opportunities and the challenges that surround us. And for that reason, I'm very excited for today's session on how global demographics are shaping investment opportunities, being presented by my friend and industry veteran, Dr. Clint Laurent. Before I hand it over to Clint, let me give you a few reasons why I think Clint is uniquely qualified to be presenting to us today. First, Clint's been observing and analyzing, forecasting, and interpreting demographic data for over 25 years. The countries he and his firm cover account for 92% of the world's population and 96% of its GDP. Clint's analysis tracks and forecasts the changing nature of populations, labor forces, households, and their income expenditure patterns all the way out to 2045, and the implications of that change for each country's society and economy. Last but not least, Clint's the author of Tomorrow's World, a look at demographics and socioeconomic structure in the world in 2032. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And with that, Clint, let me hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Brendan, and hello, everybody. I'm speaking to you from England, so I'm going to whip off for a cocktail after this, whereas you've still got a full day's work to go through, so I hope you have a nice day anyhow. As Brandon said, I specialize in demographics. So the company is Global Demographics Ltd, and we started off in Asia, studying countries there, and then obviously we've expanded our database such that we now cover most of the world in quite good detail. And in doing this over the years, we've obviously identified certain normalities or things that happen, and it's actually quite interesting how much demographics constrain what the future will be like. You know, you can't just suddenly change things demographically and have a totally different society. But you should be aware how things can vary and how they potentially could impact future investment opportunities. The obvious sort of examples are, how will birth rates affect China? Or what else will affect China in the future? Should you be investing there or starting to pull back? India, is it going to be the next China? What has to happen demographically for that to happen? Can that happen? So I'm going to raise a whole series of issues as I go through this presentation, and they should leave you probably with more questions than answers, but the fact that you're asking those questions is probably useful for you. I'm going to cover a number of different countries. I'm going to start off with China because that does tend to be the top of most people's lists. Then I'll look at India because that's the second one that people tend to look at. Then we'll look at Japan because in some ways that's leading the world in terms of how demographic profiles of the world or demographic profile of countries will change in the future. Then we'll have a look at Southern Africa, because that's, when I say Southern Africa, I mean Sub-Sahara Africa, because that in a sense represents a very large proportion of the population that's changing quite dramatically differently from what you'd say North America and Western Europe is changing. So that are giving you some new features to look for and new trends to look for. And then because of where we are and where you are, the United States, what trends are happening there that you should be aware of. And then if we have time, Eastern Europe and South America, which of course, South America is obviously important to you in the United States. We've got quite a lot of ground to cover. My forecasts go out to 2065 now. There's a very recent innovation. We have a totally interactive model. We can run all sorts of analyses out to quite a long period of time. So in the chart, you'll see it running out to 2065. Okay, enough preamble. So let's start with China. We have quite a large number of clients, and the key question I've had from clients over the last 2 years, but really post-COVID really, is what's going to happen to China because the birth rate plummeted during COVID. Will it recover, and will the changes in the one-child policy have much impact? The answer is at the moment we don't know the answer to any of those questions because we actually don't have data for a year yet after the lockdown was removed. And obviously it takes 9 months for a baby to appear. The average Chinese person was pretty careful about not needing to get out to a medical facility while the lockdown was in place. So you can't really expect an uplift until at best starting about 3 months ago and coming through to next year. So what we've done is look at 3 scenarios. And what I would say to you is the birth rates overall is not what I would call a major criteria for the future of China. Remember, whatever changes in birth rates now won't actually affect the labor force for 15 years because in China, working age starts at age 15, and it won't affect the number of women of childbearing age for at least 15 years. So whatever happens now is only going to affect the child market in the next 15 years, and it won't affect the labor force, and it won't affect the involvement of households, etc. in China. Secondly, the impact, we've got 3 scenarios I've put up on the screen here for you. One is where you have a very high birth rate, that's 60 per 1,000 women aged 15 to 49. The middle one is 44, which is where China has been since 2005. China's birth rate has been chugging along at 44 all that time. A couple of blips when they changed the one-child policy in 2015 and then 2017, but it went back to 44 but just before COVID. So that's the norm for that to happen. So with that in mind, then under those 3 scenarios, you can see that in actual fact, the rate of the difference in the births over the long time is only about 300 million between the worst case and the best case. And between the normative case, it's actually only about 100 million, which in the context of 1.4 billion is not extreme. Where it is a little bit more important is on the bottom right chart, you'll see that the number of women of childbearing age does level out under the high birth rate, but that is the least likely to happen, and it's more likely the orange and green line, so that will continue to decline. And that really means long-term, China's total population definitely will start to decline. It can't be avoided. So this next chart of mine looks at what's going to happen to the labor force, because that's actually what's going to affect the GDP. And again, under any scenario, the 61, which is very high, and the low one of 30 shows that under all 3 scenarios, the size of China's labor force will start to decline after 2000, well, really after this year. It starts to go into quite steady decline. That's assuming, this is the working age, but the labor force assumes that the propensity to be employed stays roughly at the present rate. Obviously, if that goes up or down, it will move it slightly, but not significantly. So really the first important message from these 2 slides is it is a reality that the number of people they have employed in China will decline. And it will decline from around about 750 million now to a best case of 600 million and a worst case of 450 million. And that is going to have implications for the size of the economy. So that's a given. It is very unlikely that any of that policy could be altered. And why do I say it's unlikely? It would need the birth rate to get above 60. It needs to get up to 70. And that's just not possible. There's no country of the level of education of China and the level of individual consumer affluence in China that has a birth rate over 50, and there's none that have it over 70. As you know, Singapore, South Korea have tried to lift birth rates with considerable incentives, it just doesn't work. So don't expect it to happen in China either. So with that in mind, here's what's going to happen to the employed labor force. This is, we've taken the number of people of age 15 to 49 separately for the urban and rural population, and then we've applied the existing propensity to be employed. It could go either way. It doesn't leave a lot, the propensity to be employed. And those two lines are very important. The orange line is the number of people who are living in a rural area. It's not based on their hukou or anything like that. It's where they're actually registered as living. And these are people who are of working age and are not living in an urban area. And as you can see, historically, it has declined quite rapidly. And in actual fact, it starts to slow down its decline after about now, because they literally are running out of working age people in the rural areas to move into the urban areas. Basically, what we're starting to show here is that past trend of 20 million people a year moving from a rural area into an urban area and taking up an urban job, or the head of household was, that area is now coming to a halt. And that's really quite significant, because the blue line there is the number of employed people in urban areas. Now, when I say employed people in urban areas, I'm talking about people who are basically engaged in tertiary type occupations. It's manufacturing, office work, science, research, education, etc. Those jobs typically in China will have a productivity level of about 3 to 4 times higher than a rural worker. So that movement into urban areas and then the production created by those workers, with that rapid growth shown in the first part of that blue curve, is really what drove the very rapid growth of China's economy. And the really important point that comes out of that is that stops in about 3 to 4 years' time. The reason it stops is the slower immigration coming from the rural area to the urban area. And because of the aging of the population, including the urban population, the size of the 15 to 64 population starts to shrink. And so all of a sudden, one of the key engines of China's economy comes to a physical halt. And that's quite dramatic. And just to take a little step back, I don't want to spend too much time on it. The one-child policy was introduced in 1976 and was subject to some criticism, but it actually had a very powerful positive message. Someone in China said, unless we control the number of children, we won't be able to educate them. So they introduced the one-child policy. Then in 1984, they introduced compulsory education. From 1984 onwards, every child in China, aged 6 to 12 and now up to 15, has to attend school. It's free. They're all being educated. And it means that the children that are entering the labor force from basically about 97 onwards, every child had at least lower secondary, if not upper secondary. And then you went into the third phase of China's development. Someone in the government said, okay, we've got all these educated people. It's no good having them planting rice. Therefore, we better build cities. We better build factories. We better build roads. We better build everything and encourage investment to take advantage of it and get these people employed, which they did. And as you probably know, 47% of their GDP has been going into fixed capital investment up until last year to create the infrastructure to keep these people employed and help the economy to grow. So it sounds like a great product for China. And let's face it, they have done quite well. But here's the message that I think everybody's missing. It runs out of steam in the next few years. This chart, let me explain it in a little more detail. The orange line here, which is, as you can see, rising quite steeply, is the productivity per worker. And as you can see, up until 2024, it grew really quite rapidly. Now, we see that productivity starting to slow down for two reasons. First of all, China has to cut back on its fixed capital investment for a number of reasons. As you know, they've built too many flats, too many things like that. Also, they can't run at 47% of GDP every year forever. It has to slow down. Countries, the global average is 27%. We have China growing down to 37%. So it means that the marginal GDP behind each worker is also slowing down, which affects the productivity of the worker. And thirdly, the marginal gain in education is slower, which lifts the productivity per worker because now they are so well educated. So the orange line, which you can see there, is actually flattens out quite a lot. It still grows and still grows at a good rate compared to many other countries in the world. The other line then is the total number, urban and rural, that are employed people. And as I mentioned, it peaks in the next couple of years and carries on in a decline. Now, those two lines combined, multiplying the number of workers by the productivity per worker, results in the dark blue line here, which is the total GDP. And this is what very few people have realized, that China's total GDP probably stops growing altogether around about 2032, 2033. Unless they can come up with something really radical in lifting productivity per worker, then China's GDP will actually flatline. GDP per worker keeps going up, per capita income keeps going up, but it's just because the number of workers is going down at a rate that offsets the normal increase in productivity, China's GDP will now flatten out. So that's enough on China, but that's really a big message. A lot of people are assuming China will get back to really rapid growth. We're saying, well, yes, it might too, but the only way it can do it now is coming up with some radical ways of lifting the productivity per worker above what's actually already a reasonably steep line. That orange line, while it's slower than what it was before, is still growing quite rapidly compared with other countries. So keep that in mind in your investment strategy. Ask questions relevant to it, and it might just be quite useful to you. Well, enough on China, and we'll now look at the next big one, which is India. And the most frequent question or comment I hear in terms of this is, well, India is going to be the next China. And then unfortunately, the United Nations, which always likes to make things look positive, which is nice of them, but it's not always the most helpful, they say, oh, well, India is going to do well because it's got a demographic dividend coming through. The demographic dividend that they refer to is, of course, the number of working age people, which is 15 to 64 years of age. Well, the top chart there, the curve shows you that dividend is actually over. It grew really rapidly, again, up until just on COVID, and now it's got to the point that India is becoming middle-aged. And the fastest growing groups now are over the age of 40, and the age groups under 40 are actually starting to decline in size. So India hasn't got the big engine in terms of extra workers, even if they're not particularly well skilled. It actually was able to produce more people, chuck in a whole lot of fixed capital investment financed by borrowing, and you produce a nice, healthy-looking GDP growth rate. And that's what India did over the last few years. Now, that might sound as if I'm being dismissive about India, but I need to say you really should look at India actually quite carefully, because there's some things that are going on in India that actually make it a potentially very attractive opportunity in the near future. The bar chart at the bottom there, on the bottom right, shows you the proportional percentage of people by the level of education. So the bottom dark blue is no education at all, and this is working age people, by the way, adult population. Primary is orange, green is lower secondary, upper secondary light blue, post-secondary or tertiary the purple color. And I'm not sure it's widely understood, but India introduced compulsory education in 2010. So after 2010, every child turning 6 has to go to school. And it actually goes through to about age 12. They may actually extend it, obviously, over time as India gets more affluent and more kids start getting, complete the education through to 12 and is still, need a bit more education into secondary level, which would be useful to India. But taking those trends forward, you can see how India's educated profile changes really dramatically. The uneducated, who also tend to be older, die off or leave the workforce, so they plummet away. And suddenly, India starts to have a workforce whose skill level is starting to be competitive. It won't be much where China is today until about 2045, But in 2045, you'll have a working age population in India, which is as skilled as China's is today. And that's a huge change from where it is now, where it is literally half the skill set in terms of education versus China. And that means China has really very good growth prospects going ahead of it in terms of productivity per worker. But it has another big implication as well. It is universal education that India has now introduced. And so that's actually means that it's not just boys in urban areas. It means that basically it's girls in villages as well as boys in urban areas. And so the girls that come out of the system in the next 10 years are going to be equally capable to be employed in tertiary type employment or more productive type employment as a young male in an urban area. And the issue here is that females are underemployed in the Indian economy at the present moment. They're only at 34%, where normally in most countries, females are running at around about 50 or 60%. So there's this huge unused resource in India that could come on stream over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, if you do that, or if you factor that in and assume they all get jobs, then actually the India's GDP actually picks up really significantly. It's the bottom two lines. The blue line assumes female participation stays pretty much where it is today at around about 34, 35%. Green line is a bigger part, and that's where it is now. And as you can see, it'll start to tail off eventually because they too start to run out of working age population. The blue line is the lift if the females are able to get into the workforce and obviously add both to the size of the workforce and the productivity of the workforce. And I don't think a lot of people have factored this into their calculations. There is some good reasons to be a little bit doubtful about it. I mean, they are competing for lower skilled work. And India doesn't have the infrastructure and the education level yet to compete with places such as China, etc. So it's competing against a lot of African countries, obviously other South Asian countries, etc. So can it get the extra work to get these females employed? There's also possibly an implication in terms of India itself. Is there going to be some displacement of jobs? Will some males lose jobs because the females come into the workforce? It's a social issue as well, which could cause some problems. And on the other hand, it could be quite helpful. So plus then is what we're saying is India's run out of steam in terms of demographic dividend, but watch this education, watch the skilled workforce come through. And if India perseveres with it and does some of what I'd call the China strategy, make sure the infrastructure creates enough jobs for these people to be employed, then actually it could do really well. Can I point out that India only has 30% of its population in urban areas at the moment, compared to 70-odd% for China. So there's a lot of infrastructure work that needs to be done. However, technology may work for them. A well-educated young female who's good at technology probably can work in a very small city or even a large town if she's got a good internet connection and the right computers and support facilities, etc. So in a sense, India may avoid the need to build big cities to survive. Okay, so second key point then, India actually does have an upside. It's education that's going to change it. Watch that carefully. If it's fully implemented and takes place, and you see more females entering the workforce, then expect India's economy to do better than it has been in the past. Right, Japan. I've put Japan in here because in a sense, what I'm sure you all appreciate is one of the oldest, it's not the oldest, but it's one of the oldest countries in the world in terms of age of population. At the present moment, it has 122 million people. In 40 years' time, 2065, thereabouts, it'll be down to 84 million people. And the point is, that is inevitable. It cannot be avoided. And the reason for that is the number of women of childbearing age. The bottom right chart, you can see the birth rate. In our model, we have the birth rate chugging along, actually lifting slightly, because you've got a younger profile of women coming through in Japan now. So it lifts it slightly, it chugs along nicely. The reason why births reduce is because the number of women, the orange line of childbearing age, is in decline, and that can't be changed in the short term at all. Those women are already alive today for the next 15 years. They just happen to be age 1 at the moment. And then it takes another 15 years before you can significantly change that orange line a lot. And birth rates don't change so significantly that will lose the line. So really then you have to accept that Japan is going to have a decline in population and quite a significant decline in total population. Just as an aside on that, it's a concept that people haven't realized, that Japan is starting to reach peak age. In other words, around about 2045, the number of people over the age of 75 will start to decline in absolute number, which is quite important. Really leads me on to my point in my next slide, which shows you how the age profile will change. You can see at the moment there's this line here is that really the number of young people is significantly less than the number of people in middle age and upper middle age. But over 40 years, Japan starts to move almost to a box. And that gradually, if you take it really long term, starts to come there. This group will disappear suddenly. It looks very large because it's everybody over 80 years of age. And as you probably appreciate, there is quite a lot of elderly people in Japan. So that does sort of make it look bigger than it really is. They actually start to disappear over the next decade or reduce in size. Now, this raises some quite interesting questions, which you need to start thinking about what's the implication of that for Japan. And there's really quite a couple of things. First one, Japan is changing some of its norms. And here's one that, again, is not always realized by people, but it's a thing called the older worker. At the present moment, 25% of males aged 65 to 74 years of age are still in full-time employment. That's 1 in 4 males aged 70 to 74 are still working full-time. It's slightly lower for females. It's around 18, 19%. And that percentage is going up. So gradually you'll get a higher proportion of people over the age of 64 in full-time employment. And that's actually adds quite a significant amount of extra people. It's the difference between that green line and the orange line on this chart in the workforce. So it lifts the number of people who are employable. And it actually is quite substantial. So at no point in time does Japan end up with a severe imbalance, if you like, between dependents and workers. The dependency ratio actually runs along at 0.84. So in a sense, they have enough workers. That means there's only 0.8 dependent people for every 1 worker. United States trots along just on 1. Europe trots along at about 1.1. India is at 1.2. Africa is about 1.3. And that's what I'm saying is the average worker in Southern Africa supports himself and 1.3 other extra people. It makes a huge difference in terms of the household income. So the Japanese are in a very comfortable position in terms of what's going to happen in terms of in terms of their ability to maintain themselves. Just to digress ever so slightly in terms of that as well, is just appreciate that when I said 25% of males aged 70 to 74 are still in full-time employment in Japan, it's exactly the same statistic in the United States as well. And in quite a lot of countries that are, shall we say, slightly more enterprise-orientated, a well-educated person in good health is actually staying in employment rather than taking retirement. It's great for pension funds. They still pay in rather than take out. It's great for the country because they're a greater proportion are actually contributing to the economy. So in that sense, then, Japan's doing quite nicely. But as you can see, nonetheless, the labor force shrinks even with that extra lift. And there's not too much you can actually do about that. But percentage of the population employed is high, so actually everyone's doing quite nicely. The downside in all of this is obviously if you drop from 122 million to 84 million over the next 40 years, there's an awful lot of fixed capital resources that are not going to be needed. And probably the most negative aspect of that is housing. Obviously, if you drop by round about, as I said, 40 million people, you're actually dropping around about 15 million households that are needed. And so it probably is going to cause some deflation in household pricing. And that is a little bit unfortunate because that tends to be the major form of saving for actually most people, but particularly for Japanese. So that is probably the biggest implication negatively. The positive implication is there's less demand on resources, so they don't need to build more hospital beds, they don't need to build more schools, they don't need to build more roads. So the economy can actually track along quite nicely with the government spending moving away from, shall we say, infrastructure into social structure. So the Japanese may well lead the world into a whole new area of government expenditure and development, and that in a sense creates some very nice investment opportunities. Are you sufficiently invested into the whole new area of medical science? Are you sufficiently invested into whole new ways of learning and using skills? Because Japan is going to lead that development because it's got the capability to do so, and therefore keep an eye on it. And I think there's some great opportunities going to come out of that because Japan leads it. So my third major message then is don't write Japan off because it's got a rapidly shrinking population. Look at Japan as leading certainly the United States and certainly Western Europe in terms of sociological development. It's going to have to confront some issues that America and Western Europe and affluent Asia, that's Japan, South Korea, etc., are going to have to deal with as well in the next 15 to 20 years. So it's a great laboratory to look at, study, and be prepared for the new trends that emerge. Finally, what's going to happen for the economy as a whole in Japan? Well, they only have to lift the productivity of the average Japanese worker by 1% per annum, and total GDP would be maintained in the short term. That's the orange line. It's overwhelmed by the shortage of workers again, so it does decline. But GDP per capita will grow every year into the future with a 1% lift in productivity per worker. And Japan should be able to achieve that in the future. It's been below that in the past for a variety of reasons, including a lot of social work, keeping social created work to keep older population employed. Now the pressure's going away, so you can expect the GDP to start to slow down there in total terms. Okay, Southern Africa. Now, first of all, just point of definition, Southern Africa is really sub-Saharan Africa. I've lumped all those countries together. We've got data on just about all of them, and so appreciate I'm really talking of a large number of people in this area. The key thing about Southern Africa is it's going through huge population decline. Basically, the propensity to have children is still very high, and it runs in the 60, 70 per 1,000 women of childbearing age. So even with quite a rapid decline, as you can see, it's 100 in the left-hand chart, it's 160 births per 1,000 women. It drops to 140 now. We've got it going all the way down to 80 because of improved education over time. So that's what we see as being the trend. We think most governments in Southern Africa are starting to value education and they see the importance of doing it. Whether they all achieve it will be another issue, but there is a degree of political control and there's a degree of will to get it changing. So we think it will happen. So that's the plus side, if you like. But unfortunately, when you drop birth rates, it takes a long time for it to start slowing down population growth, because a high birth rate 15 years ago means you've got a large number of couples of 15 to 49 years of age now and keeps growing. So they will have, even if they have a much fewer children, it still adds a lot of extra children. So the total number of births is that dark blue line, which curve flattens out in 2060. But until 2060, it grows really steeply. And the blue line is number of women of 15 to 49. You can see that's still growing. It starts to turn around about 2070, 2080. So a reality, the population of Southern Africa is going to grow very, very rapidly in the future. And basically, the key figure to look at is it increases to 25, and the number of births per annum will increase to 25 million a year, but through to 2055. And the median age is 17. That means half the population in Southern Africa are under the age of 17 and will reach working age in the not too distant future. So let's have a look at the impact of that on working age. And here's the interesting figures for you. The lines to look at. First of all, the light blue line that goes up very, very steeply is the number of people of working age. So right now, in all of those countries, you've got around about 325 million people of working age. In 40 years' time, you'll have 850 million people of working age. So what I'm saying to you is the number of people who will expect to be in work in Southern Africa in 40 years' time will be more than double the number today. That's an awful lot of people looking for work. Now, if you apply their propensity to be employed, the present level, taking into account their education level, life expectancy, all of those sort of things, it's the dark green line at the bottom here. Now, at the moment, again, you can see it's about 200 million people who are in work at the moment. If we maintain the propensity to be employed, we need to be up to 550 million jobs in 40 years' time, and you actually have to be double 400 million in 25 years' time. So these countries are going to have to attract a huge amount of investment to create that level of employment. Can they, and will they be able to? If they can, and they can maintain those levels of employment, you actually potentially have a happy outcome coming through, in the sense that GDP will grow, personal affluence will grow. But if it doesn't happen, then the worst case is you end up with an awful lot of households with one worker and perhaps 3 dependent people. So you're talking about a dependency ratio of 3 to 1. And that means the money doesn't go very far at all. We actually are quite pessimistic about this. We see it actually becoming a major social problem. And why do we reach those conclusions? Well, really, the major reason for reaching that conclusion is a lot of other parts of the world better educated, and shall we say slightly more solid political environment, more reliable political environment, who are also got it, or who also have a rapidly expanding working age population. So there's going to be a lot of competition for work on a global basis. People wanting to make shoes, clothes, machinery, export, import. It's all, the competition is actually going to be quite huge. And our analysis across all the countries that we cover is that investment tends to go where you have a skilled workforce. Wages are important, but the skill of the workforce seems to be more important than wages. A really well-skilled worker with adequate fixed capital investment is much more valuable than a skilled or a well-educated person without fixed capital investment. So the fixed capital will go to where the education is. And these countries are behind the 8 ball in terms of this. Why? Because they are at the moment poorly educated, with obviously 1 or 2 exceptions amongst these countries. Generally, the majority of the population in these countries at best have primary or very small portion of lower secondary education. It can't change rapidly, because even if they do what India's done and introduce compulsory education, it takes another 8 years for those kids to have that extra education, and then another 10 years for them to significantly influence the profile of the workforce. So it's something that changes very, very slowly. On the other side of this equation, and why I'm concerned about it, the United States on its own accounts for around about 30% of all private consumption or household consumption expenditure. Chuck in Western Europe and Japan, South Korea, etc., and 60% of the world's consumption is consumed by that small group of countries. Add in China as well, another 17%, and 3/4 of the world's consumption is by populations that are now aging, where the average age is over 40. And as you're probably aware, as people get older, they tend to save more and spend less. Consumption spending tends to slow down. So you've got this conflict emerging where you've got a large part of the world, Southern Africa, the same story for Northwestern Africa, and the same story for India and what we call South Asia. A lot of people coming on stream looking for work, tends to be lower quality work because of the education system, whereas at the same time, the people who consume those sort of products, because they're basically available quite cheaply, they're slowing down on their spending. So there is a conundrum emerging here, which may create some investment opportunities. It may also create some problems for the world, which are going to have to be confronted in some way, because these people aren't going to disappear. Remember, they're already alive today. So we do need to be aware of what's happening in terms of that. So that's what we see happening there. Basically, Southern Africa, we see it growing. We see the GDP per worker growing, but growing very slowly. But the total GDP of these countries will grow very rapidly. It's really a volume game in terms of lots of stuff produced by a lot of people, but those individuals are A, not paid very well, and secondly, will not actually experience much growth in their productivity over the next 40 years. In other words, their affluence will not improve all that much as well. So it really is a major concern. That's why I have put this set of slides up, because I do think you need to be aware that that's coming along. Right, now to switch to another part of the world entirely, the one you're most familiar with, it's the United States. I'm not pandering to you, but the reality is the United States is really in a sweet spot in terms of its existing demographics. Yes, the birth rates are actually slowing down. Yes, you've got some increase in the aging population. Those things are and have been happening. But overall, here, this chart shows you the trend out 40 years of the different age profiles of the population, the different age groups of the population, all the way after 2065. Now, these trends are pretty reliable. The only things that can change them, if there was a substantial change in birth rates, it would change the youngest age groups in 40 years' time. That would have some effect. But are the birth rates actually going to plummet in the United States in the next 10 years, 15 years? No, they may go down, but they're not. It would be unusual for them to plummet. Nor is it very likely they'll go up, because you've got a good standard of education, and that tends to work against it. Similarly, when you're looking at the 65 plus, well, all those people are alive today. They just happen to be younger at the moment. They're going to happen. There might be a bit more longevity, might trick it up a bit, or it may drop down. But as you can see, in the United States, for example, the purple line here, the growth in the 65 plus age group, which does have significant healthcare implications, or it tends to, that growth rate's going to flatten out. And so the demand on the health sector, or the growth in demand on the health sector, is actually going to level out. And that's going to have implications for that, the whole healthcare investment sector. It's still going to be very, very important, but the growth dynamics are going to change, and probably the sources of return on investment are going to change, because it's no longer more customers, it's actually more customers needing a different type of treatment, or better treatment. The kids market, that's the 0 to 14, flat, you don't need to build more schools. Instead, the same money can go into lifting the quality of the schools, the quality of the facilities, and perhaps smaller class sizes, all of those sort of things. And then again, they're what I call the working age empty nesters. Those are the people with disposable income. So the kids hopefully are off their hands, the household is paid for, mortgage is off, it's equipped. They have much more discretionary money than any other age group. That particular group of consumers is going to chug through quite nicely as well. So you've got a really stable consumer environment going forward, and retail can manage that quite well, but it's going to be some tricky issues in terms of it. We think your employment rates will stay quite high, because your labor force is well educated, because I don't want to get into politics, but your future president is talking of significant investment in fixed capital investment and infrastructure. That helps employment as well. So we actually see as you can see, your total working age doesn't decline, it levels out. So it's better than Western Europe, for example, and your percentage of working age employed stays fairly high at 65%. That's actually quite high by world standards. So what it's really saying in total is that your economy is settled down to a nice, almost, I'll use the word rut, but I don't need it negatively. You're in a nice pathway which should progress, and there's no reason why you shouldn't achieve something like this chart here. On the left, the dark blue line is GDP per capita, because you've got good education coming through, you've got good infrastructure coming through. There's every reason to expect your productivity of your workers to keep growing. That means the total employed is going to keep growing in the United States. So you could expect the US GDP, which is the right-hand chart, show reasonably good growth going forward. So you might actually be living in the one actual marketplace in the world that actually has a really solid growth prospect coming forward. And I think at the moment your stock market is actually recognizing that is coming along. Immigration, it's not a major issue. Legal immigration into the United States is very low as a percentage of the population, and it's obviously properly controlled, etc. Illegal immigration, it's going to presumably come under control. It is actually a global issue, not an American issue. There is just huge numbers of people moving to looking for jobs and more secure environments. It does change the dynamic slightly. We can't forecast that. You have to make your own form your own views on the implications of that for the United States. We include legal immigration in the figures I've just presented to you, but not illegal. Right, Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe is almost the antithesis of what we'd call well-educated societies, age development. Whereas in the United States, all those age groups were trending flat or slightly up. As you can see, in every age group, with the exception of the oldest, they're all in decline. In short, the population of the Eastern European countries is now in decline. Part of it is driven because of immigration. Some of these Eastern European countries, Poland, for example, have access to countries in the EU, and by simple movement to the EU, they've been able to increase their earnings quite a lot. So actually, these countries have suffered from from more affluent countries taking their talent from poorer countries. So they have been suffering in that respect. And that's a little bit unfortunate for these countries. However, key things to appreciate about this group of countries is they actually have a huge strength. They are very well educated. And the education index, which is the orange line there, as you can see, it's trotting along at 260, 270. That's competitive to the United States. And what we're saying is the profile of working age people in these countries in terms of education is equivalent to the United States and most of Western Europe. So you've got a well-educated labor force. Where these countries are behind the eight ball is they haven't attracted their level of fixed capital investment. Now, unfortunately, I haven't really put that in there for you, but basically it's a well-resourced what you've got the labor force, and the accumulated fixed capital investment per worker is really what's now up to the standards. It's $40,000 per worker. The United States is over 100,000, so you can see it's much, much lower. Now, there's probably political reasons behind that, being under investment, but the issue is it means that the workers aren't being as fully, don't have the necessary resources to lift their productivity as much as you would like it to happen. So for that reason, these countries have been behind. However, we actually do see them as being a group of countries that you might want to consider carefully in the future. If they become a bit more politically stable, and they become a bit more friendly through tax systems, etc., towards encouraging fixed capital investment, then you would find that probably those economies would start to lift quite rapidly. So if that happens, then obviously you would get some quite good returns on investment. Again, to repeat myself, education is the hardest thing to change. Well, education and birth rates. In the case of these countries, the issue is that nailed education. It is actually to a very good competitive standard. It's quicker to change fixed capital investment. I know it takes a few years, but it's only a few years, and suddenly these countries could become very important. Already, for example, some of them are starting to get into electric vehicle production, competing with China. Their labor costs are not out of league with those of China, so they actually can start to compete in that area. And they are certainly starting to, I can't talk for the United States, but I have to say I'm in the UK at the moment. In the UK, these countries are starting to export quite successfully into the European markets. Once when you went into a clothing shop in the UK, most of the product on sale was made in China. Now you go into a clothing shop in the UK and it's at least half, and if probably even two-thirds, are made in what we would classify as the Eastern European country. So they are starting to get there. So there's a group of countries that perhaps have been off the radar, but you might want to start putting back into your radar now. There's just two areas I want to cover before I wrap up. One is South America, and I've just basically drawn a line across the top of South America and put all the countries together in there. I can do that with some confidence because their age profiles are actually relatively similar. There's no one badly out of step. Key thing to note about South America, it is middle-aged now. It's not young. It reaches peak population in 2048, and then it starts to drop away. All the youth markets in South America, in terms of number of consumers, are actually in decline now. So if you're marketing a youth product or service, you're going to have to change your orientation from selling to more customers, selling more to a fewer number of customers. The working age employed empty nester is there. That's that blue line. That's a great opportunity. It's just like what China was and still is for a little while longer. Look to that. It's going to be a good opportunity, but then that will peak around about 245, 247. So again, it's a good opportunity now, but it's going to disappear. The age market starting to grow a little bit steeper now, and that will start to create some social problems because this group haven't had the great as good a nutrition, so there will be a slightly greater healthcare demand on it. But basically, peak population reached in 2048, and then the combination of deaths and immigration means then it'll start to slowly decline in the future. However, employed labor force is stable, but basically it is producing below what you call its potential. You'd expect the proportion of population employed to be higher than 60%. It's just trotting along at 60%, and therefore it has some upside. So it also is going to be looking for jobs, and it's in quite a good position to do so because the education in these countries is again quite good. It's a lot better than Southern Africa and Western Africa. And that's really what I've got on the next slide here. The orange line is the education profile. It has been lifting quite steeply. It levels out because of two reasons. Aging of the population, so there's fewer kids coming out of the education system. And secondly, it's already to a high standard. An extra PhD doesn't actually lift the education profile a lot if you've already got 100,000 PhDs there. So the marginal gain of the higher education is much less. So you can see it flattens out. So that's the good news. The issue is accumulated fixed capital. If they keep at their present level of investment, that will keep growing. And that means productivity per worker, the blue line here, will keep growing as well. The unfortunate thing is, because the labor force flattens out, or peaks and then flattens out, you won't get quite the same GDP growth in this area longer term. It will slow down. And then finally, what I wanted to get in is just quickly Mexico. It's in better shape than what people realize. It actually has an education standard competitive to China. It's a little bit behind China in terms of fixed capital investment per worker. So their productivity is not quite as good, but it's not bad. But basically, given its physical location relative to the United States, given its skill set in terms of its workers, it actually is in a really good position to take some of the China sales into the United States away from it and actually bring it revenue into Mexico. Although do be aware, a lot of Chinese companies have invested in Mexico with a view of accessing the North American market from Mexico. So it's a market worth watching. We think Mexico actually has some good upsides if it can handle the politics.
Clint, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. Happy holidays.